Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm Mark Schumacher. I'm the CEO of the Home Furnishings Association, and our webinar today is one that critically important really for anybody in the home furnishings industry, because we're looking at that stimulus that was passed at the end of the year, how that's impacting many of you, access to pieces of it that are critical. Also, however, we're looking at a huge changeover in Washington when it comes to the power structure. What does that really mean from the standpoint of key committees that we need to be communicating with, or appointees to different departments within the government? There are a lot of moving parts, and whenever we have a situation like this, we always go to our expert. Chris Andresen is joining us. He is our lead lobbyist in Washington. We work with Chris on a regular basis, multiple times per week, constantly understanding what are the key issues being talked about in Washington, and what can we as your association do to really push the things that you need for your business to grow. So Chris, first and foremost, thanks for joining us. Before we get rolling, I want to remind people of a couple of things. This is being recorded, so if you hear something today that really resonates with you and you didn't have a chance to grab a note, or you want somebody else to look at it, myhfa.org, go there. All of our webinars are listed. It's a wonderful library of information at your fingertips at any time. So that's really, really key. Second of all, there are some handouts here. I don't want you to jump there just yet, but we do have the PowerPoint you're going to be seeing today. You can download that if you'd like, plus a really great information sheet that Chris put together. So I think that I got all of the housekeeping done. Chris, first of all, thanks so much for joining us. And before you begin, I just want to get from you, as somebody who lives it, how incredibly unique is this? How good is this for us? Possibilities. I know there's certain things that people look at as being negatives in DC right now, but is this really truly a time of great opportunity for us as those that are representing this industry?
Yeah, Mark, thanks again. It is a really sort of paramount moment, right? And I think that sometimes it happens, once every 4 to 8 years when we have sort of a new administration. But now we have a situation, as you said, you've got a new administration, but sort of unprecedented parity between the two parties in both the House and the Senate. And as we've talked about, President-elect Biden has a monumental task ahead of him. Not only in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, you've got an economy that is really at a critical point. I mean, we saw some of the unemployment numbers today that were released. Plus, he's carrying this weight of he may be the most Washington figure we've ever had as a president. He's been in DC for almost 50 years. And obviously as a senator, but then also as vice president for 8 years. And he is, looked at as sort of this unifying figure. We're at a very, sort of fractured moment in our history as a people. And I think that's a lot to accomplish, a lot to look forward to. And again, here we are 6 days before Inauguration Day. What does that look like? There's a lot of pressure, but with that comes a lot of anticipation. Not only from from the people, but also from industries and what we can expect. And certainly we felt a lot of that over the last 9-10 months of this pandemic, working with the Congress and the administration, trying to implore them to do something with respect to additional stimulus, additional relief. Finally, that did come right before the end of the year. And now you're at a point now where just tonight, the president-elect Biden's going to be giving a speech sort of outlining his next COVID-19 package. And again, no one expects that to be the only. That's sort of the first and sort of a multiple step process.
And the one thing I'll say before you really get into the depths of this is, and this is to everybody that's listening, this is about finding that information that you need to navigate. This is not a spectator sport. We need each of you to be leaning on the connections that you have, not only in Washington, but in your local areas. That's what this is really all about. We have the same needs. There may be different people in leadership roles, but our message is still the same. So let's look for ways, as Chris goes through this, to navigate moving ahead. And that's what we're here for, is to help lead that charge with Chris on your behalf. So Chris, let's start rocking through this. We're going to start, I guess, looking at stimulus first. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Okay. I've got a PowerPoint I'm going to pull up here with some of the other key points. Mark, because I wanted to have this not only for my benefit and your benefit, but also for the viewers. Um, as we went through and tried to piece together a deal for the last 9-10 months, as we said, there were certain elements that we felt would always be in there, would be sort of paramount. First of all, I think for both sides came to this extended unemployment benefit piece. So if you'll recall, back in the CARES Act, back in March, there was a $600 per week federal benefit added onto the state benefit. And at that point, they increased the eligibility from 26 weeks for unemployment benefits to 39 weeks. That all, of course, expired over the summer, which was, again, part of the impetus around getting another deal done. This new benefit began January 1st. It's a $300 a week federal benefit, and then they extended the pandemic unemployment insurance assistance program another 11 weeks as well. And that's for, again, there may be people on this call who are self-employed individuals, gig workers. That's that aspect of it. So again, another critical piece, that eligibility was folded in under the CARES Act. That's been extended here. And again, that $300 a week federal benefit has been put in place through mid-March. So that 11-week timeline. And, living through DC for so long, those timelines really do matter. They're not always the ultimate forcing function that we would hope they would be, but that gives you an idea of some of the conversations we had about what the Biden team and what this new Congress wants to do. That gives you an idea of timelines, right? So here we are mid-January. I mean, the next 8 weeks are going to go really quickly if the previous 10 months are any indication. So those deadlines are going to be on us very quickly. So that $300 federal benefit is in addition to the state benefit. That's a key thing, I think, not just for individuals, but also businesses and industries, because we saw that $600 a week was kind of a key economic factor, kind of keeping the economy a little more stable during some of the more uncertain times. Additional stimulus checks, these economic impact payments, the CARES Act, that was a $1,200 per person payment. In this latest stimulus, it was $600 for individuals, $1,200 for couples, and then $600 per child. So a little bit of an increase on the child side that had been $500, but a decrease overall. I will say we'll go over this a little bit. Obviously there was a big push at the end of the year from President Trump, and then also congressional Democrats and Republicans to increase that $600 to $2,000. So importantly, that's not an additional $2,000. It'd be $1,400 to bring that $600 up to $2,000. We'll get into a little bit of that later, because that's kind of emerging as one of those carryover priorities for Congress and the new administration. Mm-hmm. $325 billion. One of the key aspects, obviously, for our industry, small business relief, small business funding. There's $325 billion total for the SBA and some of its related programs. About $285 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program, and that covers both first draw and also what they've created here, a second draw PPP option for a subset of borrowers that may have already received a PPP. Making up that difference, that $40 billion difference, was some additional funding. And again, this could be something that some folks on this webinar access, was those EIDL grants through the Small Business Administration. Those were funded at about $20 billion in this stimulus package. So more funding for those EIDL grants, which of course are applied for through the SBA, whereas the PPP, you actually go through a lender to apply for that. And that second draw option, Mark, was something that we really stressed to Congress and the administration moving forward in terms of giving folks that ability to access relief as they needed it, knowing that we're still in a very uncertain time with this virus.
A couple things I want to point out, and I've had a chance to talk to not only a number of retailers, but even those of us at HFA who were trying here for a PPP loan for our association, that while it opened up Wednesday morning, many banks are still looking for the specific guidance coming from SBA. So things are not out of the gates as quickly, which is interesting. And as a matter of fact, I had one of our members told me that he felt that the process the first time around, that the bank was far more ready for it than this time around, which is interesting because you'd think it would just be sort of a plug and play. I did have, before we go any further on that, I did have a question come in that I want to get to. This is interesting. It says here, if a business has furloughed employees, will those benefits be charged to the employer's account? Does that make sense to you?
So there's a few different things there. Those, if there's somebody's furloughed, so in that case, my understanding would be you're not paying them their hourly rate or their salary, but you're still potentially covering their health benefits, and
Right.
those are things that do count towards a payroll cost for a PPP, or even something that we get to later, Mark, this employee retention and rehiring tax credit, which is something that's been expanded. Again, another I think critical piece that's been expanded for businesses writ large that we can talk to. I think that furloughed piece, specific to that question, will be more applicable for the ERTC, because
Okay.
obviously with the PPP, when it comes to forgiveness and retention, there are certain triggers in place where your forgiveness may be reduced if you don't have that same level of employees from the beginning of your loan amount to the end of the covered period. So
Terrific clarification. I appreciate that. And I want to remind people that you can, on the right side of the screen, give us some questions. We'll get to as many as we can. I'm really good at interrupting Chris. And we can get to those. But if you have a question that you need to have answered, please let us know. But Chris, I don't want to knock us too far off here, but let's talk about the eligibility for this second draw of the PPP, which again, like you said, that was not a certainty until they
right.
finally hammered this out. And we're just glad that a lot of our members that need it can get it. So.
And there were certainly several different proposals that came out over that 9 or 10 month period that we're working on and supporting. But at the end of the day, in order to be eligible for a second draw PPP, there's a few conditions that have to be met. And I think that this is really focusing in on that need conversation and making sure it's more targeted, which is something that Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, I think had a little bit of heartburn and oversight with the SBA over the course of the initial PPP program. First of all, employers, you have to have less than 300 employees. So that's one qualifying thing. Obviously, with the PPP, the first draw, that threshold was 500 employees. So they brought that down a little bit. You also have to have a corresponding revenue decline of at least 25% in any quarter in 2020 when comparing that to the same quarter in 2019. A couple things that have come out since the legislation is that SBA will also accept annual tax records. So I think that this may be particularly helpful for those smaller businesses that may not have quarterly tax records or receipts, but may have annual receipts. If your annual receipts were 25% lower than in 2020 than they were in 2019, that will also count for that 25% revenue decline.
But you can pick and choose which quarter you're comparing, correct? That's not mandated by this loan.
Correct. You can pick and choose any quarter within 2020. You just have to compare it to that same quarter in 2019. But yeah, that's up to the borrower. And again, the spirit of some of this new legislation is trying to make the process a little bit easier. I know you talk about some of the challenges that people are already having for those smaller lenders. So if you have a loan of less than $150,000, and that's kind of that bipartisan threshold that's been agreed to, you don't actually have to submit that documentation on the revenue decline with your application. You just have to submit it to your lender before you apply for loan forgiveness. So again, that's giving the smaller borrower some additional time and flexibility to submit that documentation later. And then the lenders will perform a good faith review of that information. One of the other advantages that you may have with respect to your lender and the second time around is if you used payroll information from 2019 for your loan calculation and you're using the same lender that for your second draw as your first draw, they're able to accept that as your application. They don't need any additional documentation on the front end, which again, hopefully will save some time for people if you are using the same bank. And I think that perhaps the majority, maybe not all, there was some trouble with some of the banks and lenders along the way in the first draw PPP. But again, with this eye of how can we make this process, knowing that again, it's perhaps going to be more popular now, to make it a little bit easier on folks. A couple of other changes. The loan amount calculation is still the same. Your average monthly payroll for the last 12 months or calendar year 2020, if you choose to use that, times 2.5. The difference is the first draw, there was a $10 million maximum. The second draw is a $2 million maximum. So they lowered that maximum, that maximum number for the second draw loan. I will say that we get a lot of questions, Mark, I know, and certainly the home furnishings industry. Some of our accounting methods may not match up, and I don't think we're the only one. There's different ways of doing things, but SBA did try and better define, again, provide more clarity for borrowers in terms of what those revenues and gross receipts actually mean, what that definition looks like. So I did put that there, but that was something that my guess is that if you're applying for a second draw, you're pretty familiar with that and sort of already gone through the first draw process.
How are they differentiating between the term gross receipts and revenue? What's the differentiator there?
They're really not differentiating. They're just defining what counts towards gross receipts. So there you'll see. I think the root behind this, Mark, was so that folks that had a forgiven PPP loan, they were saying that that's not going to count towards your gross receipts. So you don't include that, but you include pretty much anything else. I think that would be pretty standard. I didn't see that there was anything kind of head scratching in there to say, oh, I wouldn't have expected that. But sales, interest, dividends, royalties, I think a lot of those more traditional categories, but there was certainly something to say about making sure that your forgiven loan was not included in those revenues.
So when you talk about revenue up higher, about the comparison quarter to quarter, that is not just gross receipts, right? Is that all in?
It's sales, interest, anything that you took, but it doesn't include your PPP. So you may have gotten a PPP loan right in March or April, whether it's at the tail end of the end of the first quarter or the second quarter, and that may have impacted your revenue, theoretically. But what they're saying is you don't count that, so that won't count against you as you're comparing your revenue numbers from 2020 to 2019, because you had that PPP. And one of the things that you had mentioned, Mark, on the process and the rollout, it has been something that again we had some of the frustrations early on. Over the course of the life of the PPP, certainly there's been concern about access and equity to smaller lenders, smaller banks, and minority-owned businesses and other low-income areas and things. And so SBA, the way that they've kind of chosen to address that is, as you mentioned, they've kind of opened it up to a subset of borrowers this week and lenders. So those community banks, a lot of banks with assets under $10 billion and more targeted borrowing community. That's where the PPP has already opened. But my understanding is that it could be this Friday, the 15th, is when it would open up more broadly to your larger, more traditional banks. But so they've kind of had a staggered rollout.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. And it's good to know the expectations, and that's helpful. I want to remind people we're talking to Chris Andresen. He is our valued lead lobbyist in DC, who does on a daily basis fight for what it is that our members need, and that's critically important. So Chris, let's continue on as we continue to review first and foremost here the stimulus that was passed late in 2020.
Right, absolutely. One of the other areas, aside from creating the second draw, there were some expanded expense categories for the PPP that were grandfathered in into the program. And so a lot of this comes back to as your business was adjusting, whether you were closed and then you had different conditions to being open, if you had to stand up a cloud system to improve your e-commerce business, or retrofit your store with PPE for your employees and customers, but also maybe you had to buy plexiglass dividers, things like that. They expanded these coverage categories for your non-payroll expenses. And so if you recall, it's still the same split where for your loan to be forgiven, you have to spend at least 60% of your funds on payroll costs. But then these four new categories will be coming into that non-payroll expense side that already includes rent, mortgage interest, and other utilities. So these four categories will be able to, again, if you have trouble meeting that 60-40 threshold, that's expanding that. I do believe, Mark, we have a survey question for the audience on this one. For those folks that are looking at either a first draw or a second draw of the PPP, would these expanded categories be helpful? Because I know it's something that representing home furnishings retailers, something we talk to Congress and staff and the administration about was, again, all in the name of flexibility. Allow us to use these funds in the most flexible way possible. And so that's where the genesis of expanding these non-payroll cost categories came from. And so hopefully, from our perspective, that will be helpful, looking ahead for businesses, and maybe as you continue to adjust, right, to this pandemic, making sure that you have more cost categories available, we thought was going to be much more helpful moving forward.
So in this quick poll, it just says, will that expanded payroll expense, will that make a difference for you? Yes, no, or the we did not apply. And you see right here, Chris, that the quick response is 67%. So 2/3 of everybody that's taking part today says yes, that expanded non-payroll expense categories is helpful toward applying. So that's huge.
Yeah, that's and again, all in the name of flexibility, because that was something that we, Mark, as you know, through emails, phone calls, meetings, one of the things we stressed to the members was, look, we're very grateful for the PPP and these forgivable loans, but at the same time, we need as much flexibility as possible. Not every industry, not every business, not every retailer is the same. So allowing them to make those decisions to help suit them and help them stay open, keep people employed. And I think that argument really did stick in terms of some of the follow-up that I've had with members and staff.
Awesome.
One of the other key areas that obviously the key aspect to the PPP is loan forgiveness, is that the loan turns into a grant. So one of the initiatives that HFA strongly supported was this notion of a simplified loan forgiveness application, especially for those smaller borrowers. And again, that bipartisan threshold was $150,000 or less. So today we still don't have the final result of this, but within the legislation, the SBA was directed to create a one-page form. And again, a true one-page form. If any of you have either already applied or thought about or looked at applying for forgiveness, certainly some lenders have processed that. I know the SBA has started to process forgiveness as well, but a lot of lenders said, let's wait, because there were a bunch of these different conversations going around. But you'll see that there really reduces, again, some of the paperwork and administrative burden on those smallest of businesses. So you're talking about descriptions and attesting to things, but not actually providing the hard data, especially when it comes to that employee retention calculation. That was something, again, simplifying that process for the smallest of borrowers, making sure that SBA and the lender has the most basic information needed. Because the reality is, yes, was there some fraud in the PPP program? Yes. From my perspective and many of the staff and members, was it coming from the smallest of businesses? No. The folks that were buying Lamborghinis had loans in the millions of dollars. And so by all means, focus and audit those guys to make sure that the money was being used as it was intended. But understanding that these smallest of businesses, we're in survival mode. And so we need to make sure that the intent from Congress was to have these forgiven with as little burden as possible to the small businesses. So that's what this came from. And one of the other pieces to that is you don't actually have to submit your records. You do have to retain them. So you'll see that there's a different length of time there. Payroll is 4 years. The other non-expense categories for your loan, that's 3 years. But that's so that, again, you hold on to them as the borrower. If there is an audit or something from the SBA or the lender, then you have those records available, but they're not required to be submitted to actually process the forgiveness.
Gotcha.
So that was something that, it was a broad coalition, but it was one of those things that for our members and, for this industry was a key piece. And so again, I think another poll question related to forgiveness is, will this process help? And, curiously, I'm also, it'll be interesting to know how many of our folks have already applied for forgiveness, given the situation, which was, is there going to be a stimulus or not? Is this program going to be changed or not? It was close a few different times before this ultimately passed, and that's why I think there was a little bit of a kind of a pullback and a little bit more of a conservative approach taken by the lenders and some borrowers in that case.
And this question is, did you experience difficulty applying for loan forgiveness through your lender? So did you enjoy easier loan forgiveness? We'd love to know your thoughts in this instant poll, this quick poll. We'll get the results here in just 1 second.
And one other sort of related aspect of this, I don't have a slide on it, is tax deductibility, right? And that's something that was
Sure.
a huge factor here. And again, it was something that in the CARES Act, the intent was for your forgiven loan proceeds to still be able to be deducted from your taxes, from your federal taxes. It wasn't interpreted that way by the IRS, and there was a lot of pushback, right? I mean, the IRS ruled that way a couple of different times to say that without explicit language from Congress that the those forgiven loan proceeds would actually be treated as income, which again is kind of in the face of this, and that was going to be a big hit for a lot of retailers on their federal tax bill. And so in this newest version of the stimulus, this new stimulus package, it did provide that clarifying language, at least on the federal side, that any forgiven loan proceeds will also be able to be deducted. So like, for instance, when you're on your payroll expenses, a lot of times those are deducted. You're able to deduct those. You will be able to do that even though those payroll costs were covered by a forgiven loan. So that was something that was a critical thing that, again, back and forth, bipartisan, a lot of really strong support. It just needed a vehicle, and then ultimately it ended up being this recent stimulus package that was there.
I don't know if you saw the results there, but 3/4 of our audience said that they did not have difficulty applying for forgiveness. So that's good. That's good news. And again, not to toot your horn or the things we're doing, these are the types of things we've been fighting for, and that simplification was one of them. So we're glad that for a lot of people, they've enjoyed that. It's something that we supported and certainly made clear.
And as you said, Mark, this is not a spectator sport. So there's a few different stakeholders here, right? You've got the legislation that passes, but then you've got the implementation and the administration on the other side. And so I think it's been really great for us to continue to interact with members of our association to bring those stories to the regulators, because they're not always hearing those, and to the members of Congress, so they know exactly, hey, this is why I'm fighting for this, is because this is what I'm hearing from various constituencies. And so having those stories, the results from these poll questions is really helpful as we look to, okay, coming into a new Congress, new administration, what are the areas we really need to keep pushing on? What are the areas where we've gotten some sort of satisfactory outcome? In terms of deadlines, I kind of glossed over it, but on the PPP program, that's available now, starting this week through March 31st. So for those folks on the webinar who maybe haven't applied, kicking the tires on different things, obviously there's the end date of March 31st, but there's also the possibility that the funding runs out, right? You have $285 billion available. So that either goes to until that runs out or March 31st. So I just wanted to put that sort of timing and deadline in people's minds. You know, one of the other key aspects to the CARES Act was this employee retention tax credit. The trick under the CARES Act was that as an employer, you really could choose either the ERTC or a PPP, right? It wasn't both. And so that was something that, you know, again, the feedback instantly we were able to get from our members to Congress and the administration was, look, if you're trying to help businesses, this is a great way to do it, but you have to increase the eligibility. And so this new stimulus did provide that eligibility. It did remove that prohibition on taking advantage of the employee retention tax credit, even if you did receive a PPP. So that's really important, because this is something I think that folks on the phone, you know, when you speak to your accounting or your tax folks, this is something to really look into, because this has been improved pretty considerably. Initially, the program was slated to end at the end of December 2020. It's now been extended through the first 2 quarters of 2021, so June 30th. And this is, you know, going back to one of those early questions, Mark, on those furloughed employees. This is one of those areas where, again, we had direct feedback from our members to say, unfortunately, we had to furlough people. We're trying to do the right thing, continue their healthcare coverage. I mean, this is a pandemic after all, making sure we're covering some of those other benefits. You know, the IRS, again, interpreted things differently to say that wasn't eligible, and we pushed back on that. We were able to get that changed administratively, but now we have legislative language that clarifies that even further. So that really gets to those furloughed employees and making sure that those wages are eligible.
Yeah, in the early days of this, as you recall, it was one or the other. You were either going to get the employee retention tax credit or the PPP, and it was a choosing between. Now you can bring those two together, which I think is tremendous and a huge. I hope everybody's hearing that, because that's a huge thing, especially if you took the retention tax credit in the first round. Let's talk about the other changes to the ERTC.
Right. So initially the credit was a 50% credit on up to 10,000 in wages for the entire calendar year of 2020. And so that basically meant it was a $5,000 credit per employee for those employers with under 100 employees for 2020. So for 2021, what they've done is they've increased the credit to 70% of $10,000 per quarter. So that's $20,000 through June 30. 70%, that's a $14,000 credit for, and again, they've increased the employee cap now to 500 employees. So if you're a business with less than 500 employees now, and you had a PPP, you're now eligible in 2021 to take this employee retention tax credit, which is an advanced refundable credit on each employee that you're up to those $10,000 per quarter in wages. One thing I will say about this, and this is where the term here in DC is double dipping, which we see that in a bunch of different areas, but basically what it does say is you can't apply the credit to wages that are covered by forgiven proceeds from the PPP. So this could apply to perhaps those employees that may make over the threshold for the PPP, which is still $100,000 for those employers. So prorating that salary, so anybody paid over that. But even if it comes after that initial period that you have for your PPP loan, you can look to do that. You know, one of the other initially for the ERTC, the trigger was you either had to be closed due to a federal, state, local government ordinance, which, you know, that happened a lot of places across the country, not everywhere, in sort of the second quarter of 2020. So that was one thing. Or you had to show a 50% reduction in, again, this term, gross receipts. And again, that threshold has now been lowered. You've still got the trigger for have your operation suspended, but now the revenue reduction has been decreased to 20%. So again, that's going to expand the eligibility pretty significantly when you think about A, the employee cap, right? B, that revenue test, and then A, knocking out that prohibition on folks that have received a PPP. So this is a significant change, Mark, and I'll say that initially, and again, DC accounting is a little strange sometimes, but initially the score for this provision in the CARES Act back in March was about $55 billion. We don't know exactly. My guess is it's going to be much less than that because people chose the PPP because that's essentially a grant.
Right.
But the expectation is some of the projections we saw in this recent stimulus was that this, these expanses here and the extensions would perhaps cost somewhere between 15 and $20 billion. So it'll be interesting to see, and I'm again curious from our members as this gets better known because it's only a couple weeks old now. But moving ahead, I do think this is going to be a really important tool for many of the folks on this webinar and then beyond, in our membership in our industry, because as we've heard, you're still, more and more we're seeing more of these furniture stores being able to remain open, continue to do business and do well, keep people employed, and here's another incentive on top of that that you can get in addition to the PPP. So that's a critical piece.
I want to remind people, this is Chris Andresen that you're hearing with us today. He's our lobbyist at HFA, does a tremendous job pushing forward the key items that you need to improve your business and that we can impact legislatively. We're working through the latest stimulus. Chris, I do want to make sure we talk a little bit about the landscape changes
Yes.
in Washington, but I'm not trying to rush you through this, but do we have any
great
other
lead-in. It's a great lead-in, Mark, to this last slide here, which is what we, which is kind of the fun part, right? This is the crystal balling.
Good.
Looking ahead to President-elect Biden, certainly very aware that ending this pandemic is priority 1, 2, and 3 for the new administration, for the new Congress. And you said, let's think back to when this stimulus deal was cut, and we had a lot of conversations about it, Mark, whether it was going to happen or not. And back at the end of December, Democrats didn't know that they were going to control the Senate, right? And so the events, the 2 Georgia special elections on January 5th went to the Democrats. So on Inauguration Day, as Joe Biden sworn in as president and Kamala Harris as vice president, the Democrats will control a 50-50 Senate with Kamala Harris being the tie-breaking vote. And so that, you've got a Democratic president and a Democratic controlled House, a Democratic Senate. So that does increase the possibilities of what can happen. We talked about what Joe Biden's sort of history and persona is. He is a friend to many, right? He has friends on all sides of the aisle, and so some of the points here that we're looking at, they're bipartisan points. In terms of looking at increasing funding for the vaccine. The Biden administration set a pretty ambitious goal: 100 million shots in the first 100 days. Stabilizing the economy. I do expect that the Democrats, not just Biden himself, but the congressional Democrats, and we've seen some proposals already, will really look to even further supercharge some of that unemployment insurance funding from the federal government. So we talked about that $300 a week boost that we've got now. I think that there will be some pretty significant changes kind of considered for that. Obviously, reopening schools, enhancing testing, a lot of those are bipartisan ideas. Economic impact payments, again, this is something that President Trump made a point about at the end of the year, and it's been sort of taken up. It was passed in the House. It didn't make it through the Republican Senate before the end of the year, but you've got this movement to increase that $600 per person stimulus check to $2,000, so another $1,400 increase. I'll say my understanding is, again, because costs matter, and I can certainly tell, I could have labeled this slide, just put trillions of dollars. That's what we're expecting this proposal to look like from the Biden administration. That proposal itself, just for those economic impact payments, is around $400 billion on that $2,000 piece. So then you've got state and local government funding, which again, that was one of those key asks for the Democrats that wasn't ultimately included in this most recent package. And again, that was kind of a trade-off. Democrats didn't get any new state and local funding. They did get extension of some of the CARES Act money that was still available. But Republicans on the flip side did not get any liability protection for businesses. And that continues to be something for our membership, Mark, as we know, that is one of those top priorities. And so it's interesting because when you had Mitch McConnell as the majority leader in the Senate, when he would release a proposal, he would obviously include pretty strong liability protection in there, but he never included the state and local government. So as we see some of these proposals come out from the Biden administration, from Congress now, with the Democrats are leading, I would expect that to be flipped. You know, you're going to see a pretty substantial investment in state and local government funding that could reach $1 trillion level. We don't know yet, but that's kind of the expectation. But without pairing it with liability protections. You know, certainly we talked about the small business relief for a lot of this presentation, and I mentioned the PPP right now is authorized until March 31st. It could run out of money before that. That's happened before, so we'll have to see how they want to deal with that. But you know, initially, it's really interesting. We talked about unification and the fact that Joe Biden is a creature of bipartisanship. You know, he was in the Senate for so long, has a lot of respect for the institution, and has been in government for even longer. There is going to be an initial push, and I don't know how long they'll wait, how long the Democrats will test this out to see if they can't make this initial package bipartisan. And I think here's the reason why it gets back to that unification piece. Go ahead, Mark.
No, and I was just going to say though, you know, it's interesting. You know, 50-50 split is you know, tedious at best because it just takes one person in either direction to sway something. So here's a couple of things I want to hit really quickly because you and I have had many conversations and I want to share these things outwardly. The makeup of committees will certainly not so much change, but the leadership will. I just want to kind of rip through these really quickly and have you give a thought process here. You think that where we might see some real movement, and it could be bipartisan movement. You talked about infrastructure. Ben Cardin from Maryland, you feel could really start to make some moves in that way. So this infrastructure piece that you mentioned at the bottom of that slide is not just the administration, but also the change in leadership in the Senate, correct?
Absolutely. And I mean, infrastructure is one of those, it's a bipartisan issue. You know, I mean, it's something that President Trump spoke about for 4 years. It's funny, we've had an infrastructure week, you know, every year for the last, I don't know, 15 years or something. I don't know. It always seems to be one of those issues. And again, I think for retailers, infrastructure has been one of those key issues, you know, because it's not just talking about roads and bridges, but broadband, you know, ports, investment in ports so that we can increase. I know that, you know, when it comes to supply chain, that's been perhaps a bottleneck at points. So yeah, infrastructure is seen as potentially one of those, certainly when it comes to economic recovery, how you get people to work, especially these folks that have worked in some of these really hard hit industries like restaurants, hospitality. How do you get them back to work quickly? And again, that's kind of a page, Mark, out of the Obama Biden administration. Back during the Great Recession, folks will remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA. That's something that Joe Biden, as vice president, oversaw. And there was a lot of, I mean, we had the term shovel ready, right? A lot of these infrastructure projects that were funded through that stimulus through the federal government to get people to work. So that's one page in terms of the economic recovery. You mentioned the committees, Mark. You know, again, the Democratic majority in the Senate means they will go from being the ranking member to the chairman, which means you set the hearing schedule. You know, you get to decide which bills come before your committee. If you're Majority Leader Schumer, you get to decide what bills come to the Senate floor. That's obviously something that 2 weeks ago Democrats weren't able to do. So that's a really important distinction. And I think the Democrats are going to use that very wisely. Look, the reality is, as we said, the task is monumental. There's a lot of ambition, from the administration and from the congressional level. The question, as you said, I think is going to be, what approach do you take? Do you take the approach that you just want to talk to your Democratic friends in the House and the Senate, which leaves you with no margin for error, none? You can't lose anybody because the House margin is awfully slim as well. Democrats still control it, but it's very slim. And then, or do you take a different approach, which is, let's try and make it as bipartisan as possible so that we can increase our odds, increase our margin for error, but also get a more unified message out to the American people to say, look, we want to do this together. We want to eradicate this virus together. We may disagree on some of the finer points, but we want to do this now. And so the question is going to be, Mark, which approach carries the day? If the Democrats feel that the Republicans may not be negotiating in good faith, or maybe just delaying things for that sake, then I think they can shift to a different strategy, which there is one, by the way, in a 50-50 Senate. It's a procedural tool that's used called budget reconciliation, which is something that that's been used recently to pass big parts of Obamacare and the Trump tax cuts passed in 2017. So it's something that's well known to Congress and the Senate, but there are other hurdles there. It's not a silver bullet, but it's an option, and that's where you'll hear, again, for this industry's perspective, looking at taxes. Some of these other things that we've heard for a long time. Does that come into the conversation? I think the answer to that is yes. I don't think it's going to be immediate. I think there's going to be this effort to say, what can we do together? Can we pick off 10 Republicans at least to pass a massive deal? I think that, Mark, though, our experience over the last 10 months is that, and I'm talking here again, trillions of dollars for this initial priority for the Biden folks. That's going to be tough. It's not going to be easy, but it's something that they're going to explore, and that's sort of setting aside some of these other issues related to cabinet, and nominations,
Right.
Which
Right.
again, for Democrats now, they have a much bigger advantage because they only need a majority vote, a simple majority, so 51 to pass these nominations. That was not the case back in 2000 when we had a 50-50 Senate the last time. You needed 60. Now you don't. You need 50.
You need 50, and that change was, and that they ruled that change when it came up. There was a real thought about, we've let the genie out of the bottle on that one. You don't think that there are going to be widespread Trump tax cut rollbacks, or the corporate tax rate you think is going to be safe for now? These are important issues for people on this call. Would you just briefly talk about those two things?
Absolutely. I think that the way you characterize it, safe for now, is good. I think we can probably try and better define what now means. But I do think that, look, the Democrats certainly are no fans of the 2017 Trump tax bill. There's going to be efforts within, whether it is the COVID legislation or whether it's in other legislation like infrastructure, where they're going to try and, what we call here, pay for these things, pay for these investments. I think there is, when it comes to COVID, though, it's sort of a different aspect, viewed differently, because it is an emergency, it is a pandemic. There's not as concerned as paying for that, as we've seen with, say, infrastructure. Infrastructure, I think that brings in a different conversation, Mark, where you could look at, perhaps rolling back some of the Trump tax cuts, especially when it comes to, the state and local limitations that were put in under the Trump tax bill. Some of the higher tax states. When you talked about the corporate tax rate, that was lowered to 21% in 2017. It had been at 35. During the campaign, look, Biden was very clear to say maybe we ought to increase that to 28, and again, pay for investments like infrastructure, education with that. I don't know. Again, that's a really interesting conversation for a more moderate Democrat like Joe Manchin from West Virginia or Kirsten Sinema from Arizona, um, to say, where do you want to go? And I think that all of us on this call certainly can understand we want the economy to recover. This new administration, the Congress wants the economy to recover. I think there is going to be an argument, had amongst themselves internally, is raising taxes right now, to your point, Mark, say for now, early on, the best way to achieve that economic recovery. I think right now, the feeling is leaning towards no, right now. But I do think that later on, and I'll say it, later on this year, I think it is possible that you will see perhaps a more aggressive approach to looking at rolling back, some of the Trump tax cuts, especially when it comes to those higher tax brackets. And then I do think that there will be, sort of an investigation, at least, on what should the corporate tax rate be? What do the Democrats think that should be? And right now, they have an opportunity to change it. And I don't think they're going to let that, they will let that go lightly, if at all. So yeah, there's still a lot to be written on that one, Mark.
Understood. And we know that the senator from Oregon, Ron Wyden, will take over as the chair of the Senate Finance Committee. So he will be the one we'll be looking at for those questions. But also, and you're going to see how I'm going to segue here, he is also someone who's been incredibly strong in the issue of things like illegal logging and timber. We know that there's some breaking news that I want you to let everybody know about the Vietnam 301 investigation. And for those of you who aren't aware, I think most of you are, this is the investigation that was started by the United States Trade Representative a couple of months ago, relating to allegations that Vietnam, in some cases, is using illegally sourced timber to create furniture. And this is a tariff threat for the US here. It's as far as for Vietnam, I should say, and really impacting prices. He's now in a much more powerful position. How does that impact that, and what is the latest news that you've heard about this USTR investigation? Because this is critically important to our members.
Right, and we had been sort of bracing for some sort of announcement from the U.S. Trade Representative, Mark, with respect to tariffs and Vietnam, but now reports are indicating that the USTR, what they're going to do is there was two separate investigations, as you said, illegal logging and currency. They're going to create one report for both issues, issue their report, but not make any recommendations. So they're not going to be assessing tariffs on imports from Vietnam at this point. They're basically releasing their report, and it could happen today or tomorrow. And then they're going to be sort of letting that into the hands of the incoming Biden administration. So
so we're not expecting any last minute tariffs. Okay, which is great. We've been all over this as an association, trying to stop the whole thought of across the board tariffs, knowing that the vast majority, if not everything that comes into this country is properly sourced. The concern being that this would just push prices further and mess up the supply chain even more. So Chris, that's great news. But we also have to be aware that this is a subject we have to stay on, because we now have a ranking senator who this is one of his pet projects, if you will. He's the architect of the Lacey Act. This is somebody we need to watch. Is that a fair way to say this as part of this changing landscape?
Absolutely, yes. And as an industry, we worked with Senator Wyden at the time, on some of the amendments to the Lacey Act that you mentioned, Mark, when it came to when it came to wood and timber products. So there's a long history there. We've had discussions previously, and again, when it comes to priorities for the Democrats, just generally, they tie illegal logging to climate change. And so I think we all can understand, when you have anything related to climate change in a conversation with with Democrats right now, that's going to be a high priority. So we're definitely continuing to watch that. But again, I think that by some of the testimony that HFA and you specifically, Mark, provided, we were able to show that this is sort of a solution in search of a problem at this point in time. And that we'll continue to work with the incoming administration on these issues, because as an organization, as industry, we're opposed to that too. Our members go through great lengths, working with suppliers, even themselves investing in supply chain audits and verification tools to make sure that that's not hitting our supply chain. So I think those are good, those are good planks for us to take into the Biden administration as they start to fill out what their trade priorities are going to be in this administration.
And those planks will be made of properly sourced timber. I just want to point that out. We have just a couple more minutes, Chris. I want us to skip, if we could, right to the key takeaways from today. I know that we've got those, so let's do that. So
Absolutely.
the second draw of these PPP loans is going to be a valuable asset for all of you retailers out there as you continue to navigate these very uncertain conditions. I don't think there's any doubt about that. However, what Chris talked about and what we have seen personally and a number of retailers have, get on this now. When you can get that application into your bank, do it, because there is a finite amount of funds. It ran out last time. There's less this time. So for the second draw or for the first draw, get on it, because once those funds are gone, then we have to rely on new legislation. So that's number one. Changes to the employee retention tax credit enhanced benefits for furniture retailers. We've had a number of clarification questions that have been asked about real specifics on the employee tax retention tax credit. We won't have time to get to all of those today, but we will address those to you. Those of you that sent them in, we'll send you some responses there. And the Biden administration is going to prioritize another relief package in the first 100 days. Chris, let's highlight that really quickly. You do believe that we will see at least an attempt at more unemployment benefits, as well as the larger stimulus checks to make up the difference between that $600 and the $2,000 target that was talked about. Is that fair to say that those are the two biggest takeaways at this point? Probably not looking at a lot of other nuance other than that, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the other critical pieces to that will be state and local government funding. As we said, like that's been the Democratic that the priority for throughout this pandemic, and their position is that when it comes to the response, certainly vaccinations, but testing, that a lot of those funds need to go to the state and local government. It's one thing to appropriate the money at the federal level, but getting those monies out to the state and local governments as quickly as possible is, I can't stress how important that is to the Biden administration as they look at how are we going to recover, how are we going to rescue this economy. So that's one other area. And I think, again, rolled up into that vaccination piece of it, Mark, that's going to be another key plank for this initial, I'll say initial, because we do expect it to kind of be a two-step approach, which is look at some of these key sort of more immediate pieces, and then, as we talked about, maybe use infrastructure on the back end to look at more of a recovery aspect to this. And then again, is it going to be bipartisan or not? It's going to be tight either way.
And again, that 100 days just happens to work well with when the stimulus package we talked about today sunsets in March. And so this is all coming together, and we see that there is already a deadline, and that the movement toward that has to start pretty much immediately. This has been a great commercial today for advocacy at HFA and why this is so important. We're empowering the industry by making certain that your voice is heard. City Hall, County Hall, State Capitol, and the U.S. Capitol. Chris leads our efforts primarily in Washington, but he's also heavily involved, and our team is, in every house of influence where we can make a stand that makes sense for your business and for our industry. But we need you. So please get involved. myhfa.org/advocacy is where you can get all kinds of information, but we need you to be part of this. The people you're connected to in your community that can also make a difference, allow us to help you get your voice heard and back you up in those hallways, so that the decisions being made for things like closures and restrictions, whatever it may be, that we're there side by side with you, making sure that your doors are going to stay open because you're essential and you're safe. Don't ever forget that. Also want to mention, by the way, of course, this is about the power of membership. We're creating a community to drive our industry's success. Industry success is success for everybody, but you in particular. Join us. If you're not a member, myhfa.org/join is the quickest way to do it, and we're here for you. Chris, thank you so much. So much to talk about. I appreciate the fact that how you've broken this down. And we will continue to put out information from Chris, from me, and from others in our blogs, in our webinars, and emails, et cetera, newsletters, to keep you informed about all of this. But Chris, thank you again for your continued efforts and your advocacy for our members. For the rest of you, what we hope for is health and happiness and really good business in 2021. Let's hope we can put 2020 in the rearview mirror. There's a lot ahead of us, a lot of bumpy roads, but we're going to navigate it together. I'm Mark Schumacher. I'm the CEO of HFA. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time.